Think about how strange modern justice actually is. You break a rule, and a stranger in a robe, sitting behind a wooden desk, gets to decide how many years of your life you lose. Very formal. Very civilized, apparently. Now rewind the clock. Thousands of years, long before police stations, prisons, written law, or anyone dramatically yelling objection in a room full of people pretending to be shocked. Humans back then had the exact same problem. Someone stole food that wasn't theirs. Someone attacked a neighbor over nothing. Someone ignored the rules that kept everyone else alive. So what happened to that person? Did prehistoric humans hold trials? Demand repayment? Throw the offender out? Beat them? Or kill them? The uncomfortable truth is that punishment might be almost as old as cooperation itself. Long before any government figured out how to chisel a law into stone, human groups were already working out what to do with the people who crossed the line. There was no courthouse. There was, however, very likely a circle of judgmental relatives staring you down around a fire. Before punishment could exist, though, humans first had to invent something more basic: rules. Not written rules, not laws etched into a tablet, not some prehistoric employee manual reminding everybody that spear theft is against company policy. Just social rules, unwritten, living inside a group's shared expectations of each other. For almost the entire span of human evolution, survival depended on living well with other people. Hunting large animals, sharing food fairly, protecting children, defending territory, caring for the injured, remembering which berries would turn your stomach into a war zone. All of it worked better when people cooperated. But cooperation creates an immediate problem: cheaters. If everyone contributes meat after a hunt, but one person keeps taking without giving back, that person quietly gains an advantage. If everyone else risks their life guarding the camp while one individual mysteriously vanishes the moment danger shows up, the rest of the group notices. Every time. Humans became unusually sensitive to that kind of behavior. We track favors given and owed. We remember betrayals with impressive clarity, sometimes for decades. We care deeply about fairness. Though, conveniently, our personal definition of fair becomes remarkably flexible whenever we're the one benefiting. That sensitivity likely developed alongside a whole toolkit of social weapons: reputation, reciprocity, gossip, shame, anger, and the ability to form alliances against a troublemaker. You didn't need a police officer if everyone around the fire already knew you'd stolen someone's food. You needed witnesses, and in a small community, witnesses were everywhere. Reputation functioned like a credit score, criminal record, resume, and social media feed, all rolled into one. If people trusted you, they'd share resources, cooperate with you, back you up during conflict, help look after your children. If they stopped trusting you, life could get uncomfortable fast. And this is where punishment starts to make evolutionary sense. Punishment discourages behavior that threatens the group's ability to cooperate and signals that certain actions won't be tolerated. Sometimes the punishment was mild: ridicule, criticism, demands for repayment, temporary exclusion. Sometimes it escalated into something physical. In extreme cases, a persistently dangerous individual might be expelled entirely or killed by the group itself. But archaeology runs into a real problem here. Prehistoric people left no court transcripts. A skeleton with a fractured skull confirms violence happened. It usually can't tell us whether the victim was a murderer being executed, a rival killed in a dispute, a casualty of warfare, a sacrificed captive, or someone who simply had a spectacularly unlucky afternoon. So researchers reconstruct prehistoric punishment by combining archaeology, evolutionary theory, and comparisons with surviving small-scale societies. That gives us plausible models, not surveillance footage from 30,000 years ago. Still, one thing seems clear. Long before humans built a prison, they'd already built something far harder to escape: a reputation. The first punishments almost certainly didn't begin with someone announcing, "You have violated Section 4, Paragraph 2 of the Mammoth Distribution Act." They began with something simpler: irritation. Picture a small band where everybody knows everybody, intimately, for their entire lives. There's no anonymity, no moving to a new neighborhood, no quietly changing your username and pretending it never happened. If you repeatedly stole food, cheated people who trusted you, started fights, or refused to pull your weight, the group could respond immediately. And the response didn't have to be violent. Humans are remarkably skilled at punishing each other with zero equipment. We mock, we gossip, we decline invitations. We quietly stop sharing what we have. We make eye contact with everyone except the one person who knows exactly what they did. In small, interdependent communities, these social reactions mattered enormously. Food sharing, alliances, marriage prospects, childcare, hunting partnerships, and physical protection all depended on relationships. Being socially excluded wasn't just embarrassing. It could genuinely become dangerous, sometimes fatally so. Anthropologists studying small-scale societies today have documented a whole range of methods for regulating disruptive behavior. Public criticism, ridicule, demands for compensation, mediation between families, temporary separation, and in severe cases, permanent expulsion. That doesn't mean prehistoric humans followed one universal legal system. They almost certainly didn't. Different groups carried different expectations, traditions, and tolerances for violence. One community might demand repayment after theft. Another might rely on relatives to negotiate. Another might respond immediately with retaliation. And retaliation creates its own problem. If you injure me, my brother might injure you back. Then your cousin retaliates. Then my cousin goes after your cousin. Congratulations. We've just invented the feud. And feuds have a nasty habit of outliving everyone who started them. This is probably one reason mediation and compensation became such important tools across human societies. Restoring balance peacefully is almost always cheaper than letting one argument spiral into a multi-generational blood feud. But some offenders presented a harder problem than a one-time thief. What happens when someone is chronically violent? When intimidation simply fails? When nobody in the group trusts them anymore? At all? In a small community, expulsion may have been one of the harshest punishments imaginable. Harsher than it sounds today. Being told to leave sounds like getting banned from a restaurant. Annoying, but survivable. In the Pleistocene, being cast out could mean losing your entire food-sharing network, your allies, your protection from predators and rival groups, and access to any safe territory at all. You weren't simply unfriended. You were placed entirely outside the boundary of safety. There's also ethnographic evidence that, in exceptional circumstances, communities have collectively killed individuals considered persistently and unmanageably dangerous. Researchers use these observations to build hypotheses about deep human history. But that word matters, hypotheses. We can't look at a prehistoric skeleton and confidently declare, yes, clearly a criminal, executed on a Thursday for cattle theft. Bones preserve injuries. They don't preserve verdicts. And that's exactly where the archaeological story gets genuinely interesting. Eventually, humans did something that changed everything. They wrote the rules down. Punishment stopped being visible only as a suspicious fracture on a skeleton or a neighbor who mysteriously disappeared. It became text. One of the earliest surviving major examples of written law comes from Sumer in southern Mesopotamia. The laws associated with King Ur-Nammu date to roughly 2100 to 2050 BCE, older than the more famous Code of Hammurabi by several centuries. And they contain a surprise. Ancient justice wasn't simply an endless parade of mutilation. Some serious offenses carried the death penalty, but many other violations were resolved through financial compensation. Injure someone in a particular way, and the response might literally be measured in silver. Humanity, it seems, invented the fine extremely early. Civilization was progressing beautifully. This matters because physical remains alone are frustratingly ambiguous. Archaeologists can identify skeletons showing blunt force trauma, embedded projectiles, decapitation, unmistakable signs of violence. But violence alone isn't automatically evidence of punishment. A person might have died in warfare, a feud, a straightforward murder, a ritual sacrifice, or a formal execution. The skeleton never arrives with a tag reading "convicted goat thief." Writing changes that. Once societies recorded legal judgments, we can finally see not just that people were hurt or killed, but what authorities believed deserved punishment in the first place. Then, around the 18th century BCE, the Babylonian king Hammurabi produced history's most famous law code. The surviving stela contains 282 legal judgments covering property, labor, trade, family life, injury, and theft. Hammurabi's system could be severe, but it was also structured. Punishment depended not only on what happened, but on who did it and who was harmed. Social status mattered enormously. The famous phrase, "an eye for an eye," was never a guarantee of equal treatment. Consequences shifted dramatically depending on social rank, and while some offenses were resolved through payment, others brought mutilation or execution. This is the exact moment punishment becomes larger than personal revenge. The state enters the conversation permanently. A ruler can now declare what counts as an offense, what penalty fits it, and who carries it out. That's an enormous shift, because once punishment becomes institutionalized, justice is no longer just about what a community decides to do with someone who broke the rules. It's also about who gets to draw that line in the first place. Here's where it gets complicated, because punishment was never one behavior with one purpose. It's several behaviors wearing the same hat. Sometimes it's about deterrence. Hurt one thief publicly enough, and 10 other people become passionate supporters of private property. Sometimes it's revenge, plain and simple. Someone harms you, and your brain becomes obsessively interested in restoring balance. And human ideas of balance have historically involved a startling amount of bloodshed. Sometimes it's about compensation. The goal isn't to destroy the offender, but repair the damage and stop two families from turning one bad afternoon into a generational feud. And sometimes punishment is simply about power. Once chiefs, kings, priests, and governments control legal authority, punishment can demonstrate, in front of everyone, exactly who is in charge. That creates a major debate. Did punishment evolve mainly because it helped groups cooperate? Quite possibly. Humans live in unusually cooperative societies, and people everywhere care about cheaters, free riders, and fairness. Behavioral experiments have repeatedly shown people will accept a personal cost just to punish someone they believe behaved unfairly, even when unaffected themselves. But translating that directly into prehistory is risky. A modern experiment involving money isn't a Paleolithic hunting camp. Anthropologists often compare recent hunter-gatherer societies with ancient populations to explore how small communities might regulate dangerous individuals. Those comparisons are useful, but modern foragers aren't living fossils frozen in the Stone Age. Every society carries its own history. There's an even more provocative idea, that humans may have, over long stretches of evolutionary time, selected against extreme reactive aggression within their own communities, sometimes called the human self-domestication hypothesis. The argument? Coalitions could suppress, exile, or kill chronically violent individuals, gradually favoring humans better at controlling aggression and navigating social rules. Interesting? Absolutely. Proven beyond doubt? Not even close. Human evolution has a frustrating habit of refusing to leave explanatory paperwork behind. There's another trap worth mentioning. We often assume ancient punishments turned harsh because ancient people were simply more brutal. But harsh penalties can just as easily emerge from highly organized societies. The more property a state accumulates, the more social ranks, taxes, armies, temples, and political authority it builds, the more there is to protect. Punishment can preserve cooperation, restore victims, satisfy revenge, frighten observers, and remind everyone exactly who owns the courthouse. Which means the history of justice is also the history of authority. Once states grew large enough, punishment stopped being merely a reaction to wrongdoing. It became theater, performed for an audience. That sounds dramatic, but public punishment served a practical purpose. If a ruler wanted thousands of subjects to obey laws, pay taxes, respect property, and avoid stabbing officials, quietly correcting offenders behind closed doors often wasn't enough. People needed to physically see what authority looked like. In Mesopotamia, legal systems tightly connected punishment to property, status, contracts, and family obligations. In ancient Egypt, punishment could include beatings, forced labor, mutilation, or execution, particularly when offenses threatened royal or administrative order. By the time we reach Greece and Rome, the menu of punishments becomes even broader. Fines, exile, loss of citizenship, forced labor, execution, and yes, prisons existed, though not always the way modern audiences imagine. Ancient confinement was frequently used to hold someone before trial, execution, or payment, rather than functioning as a long-term sentence itself. The Romans, in particular, were extraordinarily skilled at turning punishment into political messaging. Crucifixion was never simply a method of killing someone. It was humiliating by design, deliberately public, agonizingly slow, and intentionally visible. It communicated, wordlessly, that the state controlled not just your life, but the manner of your death. Subtle, this was not. And punishment was never distributed equally. A person's social status radically transformed the consequences they faced. Citizens, foreigners, enslaved people, elites, and the poor did not face comparable punishments for comparable crimes. Justice, literally, had social classes built into it. Religion also became deeply entangled with punishment. Breaking a rule could mean violating not only human authority, but a larger cosmic or divine order. A single crime might offend a king, a community, ancestors, or a god directly. That transformed punishment into something bigger than correction. It became restoration. The offender had disrupted the sacred arrangement of society, and punishment symbolically repaired it. There was another advantage buried underneath the religious framing, too. Spectacle creates memory. A private fine affects one person, quietly. A public execution, staged correctly, teaches thousands simultaneously. Whether the lesson absorbed was, don't commit this crime, or don't ever challenge the people running this place, depended heavily on who stood on the platform and who stood helplessly below it, watching. By this point, humanity had traveled an enormous distance from gossip around a single campfire, but the basic mechanism never actually disappeared. The group still watched. The group still judged. The only difference now was that the group had acquired architecture, and eventually, entire institutions built around that same ancient instinct. Today, punishment looks dramatically different on the surface. Most modern states no longer settle theft through clan retaliation, and nobody announces tax policy through public crucifixion. Progress, undeniably. Now we have courts, lawyers, police, prisons, fines, probation, rehabilitation programs, appeals, and enough paperwork to make a Babylonian scribe reconsider civilization entirely. But underneath all that bureaucracy, some genuinely ancient instincts remain intact. We still want dangerous individuals removed from the group, whatever the group means today. We still care about fairness. We still argue about whether punishment should frighten offenders, repay victims, rehabilitate criminals, satisfy moral outrage, or simply prevent further harm. And we still use reputation as punishment. Only now, instead of gossip spreading around one campfire, a mistake can travel across the entire planet before most people finish breakfast. The technology changed completely. The audience got unimaginably bigger. What makes the history of punishment so fascinating is that civilization never actually invented the urge to punish wrongdoers. It simply reorganized that urge, layer by layer, century by century. A small ancestral community could shame someone directly, demand compensation, exile them, or retaliate with force. A state gradually absorbed those raw powers and transformed them into institutions, written laws, appointed officials, formal courts, and standardized sentences. That transformation solved many old problems. It also quietly created new ones, because the moment any society grants someone the authority to punish others, an uncomfortable question appears: who punishes the punishers? That question has followed kings, judges, governments, and legal systems for thousands of years, and it almost certainly began long before anyone alive could write it down. Somewhere deep in our shared prehistory, a small group of humans had to decide, together, what to do about a person who broke an important rule that kept everyone else safe. There was no courtroom waiting for them, no prison, no formal legal code, just people, real consequences, and one collective, difficult decision about who was still welcome inside the circle of firelight. So the next time modern justice feels impossibly complicated, tangled in procedure and paperwork, it might be worth remembering where it all started. Not with a judge in a black robe, but with a group of deeply judgmental relatives sitting around a fire and, in all likelihood, one guy quietly holding a spear.